The lights fade in on an empty stage. A single microphone stands in the glow, waiting as if it still remembers the man whose voice once filled every corner of the room. There was a time when Ben E. King could silence an audience with a single note. His songs carried both faith and fire, the sound of gospel born in Harlem, wrapped in velvet soul. But somewhere along the road, the applause faded, and so did his name. What happens to a man whose voice could move the world, yet the world moved on without him? This is the story behind that voice, the man who sang "Stand By Me," not just as a love song, but as a promise to never give up on what you believe in. Let's get into his story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of water or tea, sit back, and let's start this journey together. Before the fame, before the timeless words, "Stand by me," ever echoed through a speaker, there was just a young boy named Benjamin Earl Nelson, born on the 28th of September 1938 in Henderson, North Carolina. His world was simple, a small southern town filled with church bells, wooden porches, and the quiet hum of hope. His father was a hard-working man, his mother a woman of faith who filled the house with hymns. Music wasn't a luxury in their home, it was survival. In 1947, when Ben was 9 years old, the family packed what little they owned and moved north to Harlem, New York, part of the Great Migration that carried millions of African-American families from the rural South to the promise of city life. Harlem was alive then. Jazz spilled from open windows. Street corners became stages. Dreams weren't just imagined, they were sung. For young Ben, the city was overwhelming at first. He missed the warmth of the Carolinas, but he found a new rhythm in Harlem's heartbeat. On Sundays, the church became his refuge. That's where his voice began to rise, strong, deep, and full of something older than his years. The congregation would pause when he sang, not because he was perfect, but because there was truth in every note. Gospel music taught him something that would stay with him for life, that the voice isn't just sound, it's soul. By his teenage years, Ben had become the quiet kid with the unforgettable voice. He wasn't the loudest or the boldest, but when he sang, people listened. He joined a small local group called the 4Bs, harmonizing under the dim streetlights of Harlem. They practiced in stairwells, on rooftops, anywhere the echo made their voices sound like a choir. It was the era of doo-wop smooth harmonies, matching suits, and dreams that often ended before they began. But Ben had something different: patience, discipline, and a calm determination that kept him focused, even when the spotlight was far away. In the early 1950 period, Harlem's Apollo Theater was the heart of black music. Every singer dreamed of performing there. Ben and his group finally got their chance, a small slot, just one song, but the applause that night made him believe this could be his path. People didn't just clap, they stood up. It was the first time he saw strangers moved by his voice, and he never forgot that feeling. Outside the theater, Harlem was changing fast. The streets buzzed with the energy of post-war America. Record stores were opening, producers were scouting, and every block had a band hoping to be the next big thing. Ben sang with several neighborhood groups before being noticed by a group called the 5 Crowns in 1958. They were polished, ambitious, and already signed to a small R&B label. When they invited him to join, he didn't hesitate. At that moment, something in his life shifted. He wasn't just singing for the joy of it anymore. He was singing for a future. The rehearsals were long, the pay was small, but he was learning how to shape words, how to breathe emotion, how to make a simple lyric sound like a confession. The 5 Crowns soon began performing at the Apollo, opening for established acts. One night, their performance caught the attention of George Treadwell, the manager of a struggling group called the Drifters. Treadwell saw something in Ben's composure, that calm intensity, that unshakable presence. It was the kind of quality only great artists have before they even realize it themselves. Ben didn't know it yet, but that moment would change everything. In less than a year, the name Ben E. King would become known across America. But back then, he was still Benjamin Nelson, a boy walking home through Harlem's quiet streets after rehearsal, humming melodies that belonged to no one else. If you asked him then what he wanted from life, he probably wouldn't have said fame. He wanted to sing songs that meant something, songs people could feel in their bones. That desire, born in the pews of a Harlem church and the echo of an empty stairwell, would soon lead him toward greatness. Because even before the world knew his name, Ben E. King already had something most artists spend a lifetime searching for, a voice that carried both pain and peace. And the world was about to hear it. By the late 1950 period, the air in Harlem was thick with ambition. Singers rehearsed in basements, record men prowled nightclubs, and every note carried the hope of being heard. When Ben E. King joined the Five Crowns, he didn't know he was stepping into history or that fate was quietly waiting backstage. In 1958, the group was booked to perform at the Apollo Theater on the same night as the Drifters, one of R&B's most famous acts. But that night, the Drifters were falling apart, their members unreliable, their spark fading fast. Manager George Treadwell, who owned the group's name, watched the Five Crowns perform and made a bold decision. Within weeks, he fired the old Drifters and replaced them entirely with the Five Crowns. Overnight, Ben E. King and his bandmates became the new Drifters. It was a strange kind of success, sudden, thrilling, and terrifying. Audiences across the South expected the old Drifters and didn't know what to make of this new lineup. In smoky clubs, some fans booed when they saw unfamiliar faces. But when Ben stepped to the microphone, the mood shifted. His baritone voice didn't shout for attention. It invited you in. It was smooth yet powerful, calm yet full of fire, the sound of gospel grace meeting modern soul. In those early months, Ben learned the realities of the music business. Managers made the rules. Singers followed them. There were no contracts that favored the artist, no promises of ownership. Still, he sang with everything he had. During a recording session for a new song, "There Goes My Baby," he demonstrated to another member how the melody should flow. The producers listened, and suddenly, the roles changed. They wanted Ben to sing lead. That song would mark the beginning of a new era. Released in 1959, "There Goes My Baby" became a phenomenon, a fusion of R&B and orchestral strings that no one had ever heard before. It was emotional, elegant, and deeply human. The song climbed the charts, and radio stations couldn't stop playing it. For the first time, mainstream America was hearing R&B not as rhythm music, but as art. More hits followed: "Dance With Me," "Save the Last Dance for Me," and "This Magic Moment." With each song, Ben E. King became more than a singer. He was a bridge between the church pew and the nightclub, between the struggle and the celebration. But behind the applause, tension was growing. The success of the Drifters didn't mean stability. Contracts were still unfair, money was scarce, and King's name often didn't appear on the records he helped define. Night after night, he gave his voice to songs that lifted everyone but himself. He was the sound of the Drifters, but not the owner of that sound. By the end of 1959, the conflict between management and King's team had reached its breaking point. He wanted respect. He wanted control over his music. And deep down, he knew his voice could stand on its own. What no one realized then was that the next time Ben E. King stepped into a studio, he wouldn't just record another hit. He would record a song that would outlive him and become one of the most enduring anthems in American music history. When Ben E. King walked away from the Drifters, he wasn't walking away from music, he was walking toward freedom. The arguments over contracts, the exhaustion of being treated like a replaceable voice, had taken their toll. In early 1960, he decided to step out on his own. It was a quiet act of rebellion, but a powerful one. At Atco Records, a division of Atlantic, King began recording under his own name. His first solo singles, "Show Me the Way to Your Heart" and "First Taste of Love," showed promise but didn't yet capture what made him special. He was still learning how to translate that group energy into something personal. And then came the moment that would define him forever. In a small New York studio, King walked in with a melody that had been haunting him for days. It was simple, heartfelt, almost like a prayer. The lyrics were inspired by an old gospel hymn, but the message was something deeper. It was about loyalty, faith, and the kind of love that stands firm when everything else fades. That song was "Stand By Me." Ender. When King began to sing it, the room changed. Musicians fell silent. The producer, Jerry Leiber, looked up from his notes. There was something in the way King shaped each word, a quiet conviction that made the song feel timeless before it was even finished. The arrangement blended the elegance of strings with the heartbeat of rhythm and blues, a sound that felt both sacred and universal. Released later in 1960, Stand By Me didn't just climb the charts, it carved its place in American culture. It was more than a hit, it was a declaration of endurance. People played it at weddings, in churches, during marches for civil rights. Every listener seemed to find themselves inside the song. For many, it wasn't just Ben E. King's voice, they heard it was their own hope being sung back to them. In the years that followed, King continued to release songs that carried his signature blend of tenderness and strength. Spanish Harlem, Don't Play That Song, You Lied, and I Who Have Nothing. Each one showcased his versatility from romantic ballads to the ache of loneliness, but all bore the same unmistakable soul. Critics began to notice what the industry had long overlooked. King wasn't just a hit maker, he was a storyteller. His songs didn't chase trends. They carried emotion that felt eternal. Still, even as the hits came, the recognition didn't always follow. Others were celebrated more loudly, their names etched in bigger letters. King's humility and quiet nature made him easy to overlook in a business that often rewarded noise over nuance. But for those who truly listened, his voice became unforgettable. It was rich without arrogance, sorrowful without despair, a sound that spoke to both joy and survival. Stand By Me became his signature, a song that would be recorded hundreds of times by artists around the world. Yet none ever captured the warmth and dignity of his original performance. By the mid-1960 period, Ben E. King had found his artistic identity. He was no longer just the man who once sang for the Drifters, he was a solo artist with a legacy already taking root. He had proven something few artists ever do, that authenticity outlasts fame. And as the last note of Stand By Me faded into silence, so began the legend of a man whose voice would never truly fade. By the early 1960 period, Ben E. King had found the sound that would define him: smooth, emotional, and timeless. Stand By Me had carried his name across America, and for the first time, he wasn't just another singer on the radio. He was the voice people trusted when they needed a song that spoke straight to the heart. The music world was changing fast. Rock and roll had gone mainstream, Motown was rising, and soul was taking shape as the country's new heartbeat. But King stood apart. His voice wasn't about rebellion or flash, it was about honesty. Every lyric felt like it came from someone who had lived it. His songs didn't scream for attention. They invited you in like an old friend sharing truth in the quiet of a late-night diner. After Stand By Me, the hits kept coming. Spanish Harlem, Don't Play That Song, You Lied, Ecstasy, and I Who Have Nothing turned him into one of the most respected male vocalists of his generation. Each song carried a different shade of his personality: tenderness, heartbreak, defiance, and grace. In Spanish Harlem, his tone was gentle and romantic, painting love as something sacred and delicate. In I Who Have Nothing, his voice became thunder, raw, emotional, full of longing that left listeners breathless. On stage, Ben E. King was elegance personified. He didn't dance wildly or shout into the microphone. Instead, he stood perfectly still, eyes closed, hand resting lightly on the mic stand, letting every word carry its own power. The spotlight didn't define him, his stillness did. Audiences felt that calm strength. They didn't just watch him sing, they felt him. By 1963, King had built a reputation not only as a hitmaker but as a craftsman. His music had sophistication, lush strings, polished arrangements, and lyrics that reached beyond teenage romance. He was shaping what would soon be known as soul pop, bridging the worlds of gospel sincerity and orchestral beauty. Critics praised his ability to make pain sound poetic, to turn ordinary words into emotional revelations. Behind the scenes, however, King remained humble. He preferred family to fame and simplicity to spectacle. Friends described him as gentle and disciplined, always arriving early to rehearsals, always respecting the musicians around him. While others chased headlines, King chased perfection. The success of those years placed him among the giants of early soul, standing alongside Sam Cooke, Ray Charles, and Jackie Wilson. Yet even among them, his style remained distinct. Where others preached or wailed, King pleaded. His voice was a conversation between the human heart and the heavens above. Television appearances, national tours, and glowing reviews followed. He became a familiar face to both black and white audiences, helping to bridge racial divides through the universal language of music. In an era still scarred by segregation, his songs played on jukeboxes in diners across America, proof that sincerity could cross every line. Still, even at his peak, there was something reserved about him. While the world saw a rising star, he never saw himself that way. To him, fame was fleeting, but truth in music was forever. That quiet humility gave his performances a purity rarely found in show business. For a few shining years, Ben E. King was at the very center of American sound, the kind of artist who didn't just define a genre but elevated it. And yet, as every artist eventually learns, the higher the light shines, the deeper the shadow it casts. The applause was still loud, the lights still burned bright, but somewhere beneath the glory, small cracks were beginning to form, the kind that only time could reveal. Success, in Hollywood and in music, rarely comes without a cost. By the mid-1960 period, Ben E. King had achieved what many only dreamt of: chart-topping singles, sold-out tours, and a voice adored across generations. But behind that golden image was a quiet storm. For years, he had carried himself with humility. He never chased headlines or scandal, never demanded attention. But in the record business of that era, humility often meant invisibility. Managers and labels held the power. Artists, especially black artists, were expected to stay grateful, to sing, smile, and not ask questions. King had always believed his talent would speak for itself. Yet as his fame grew, the money didn't match. The same songs that built Atlantic's reputation, "Stand By Me," "Spanish Harlem," and "Don't Play That Song," filled radio stations and jukeboxes. But his royalty statements told another story. Others were getting rich from the sound that carried his name. It was the cruel paradox of his time. The more beautiful the voice, the more easily it was exploited. In interviews, King rarely complained. He would smile politely and talk about the music instead. But friends later recalled that he often felt betrayed, not by the audience, but by an industry that treated soul like a product rather than art. He wasn't bitter, just disappointed. Meanwhile, the musical landscape was shifting. The British invasion swept America, and suddenly, the airwaves were filled with guitars and accents from across the ocean. Younger audiences gravitated toward new sounds. Radio stations that once played Ben's rich ballads now turned to the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and the fast-rising Motown act. King tried to adapt. He recorded new material songs like "Seven Letters" and "What Now My Love," each carrying that unmistakable voice, full of warmth and vulnerability. But trends were cruel. The industry that once celebrated him began to move on without looking back. The stage lights dimmed gradually, not dramatically. There was no scandal, no public fall, just a quiet fading, as though his music had become too gentle for a world growing louder by the day. Yet even as his records stopped climbing the charts, his dignity never wavered. He continued performing, showing up to every gig, singing with the same conviction as he did at the Apollo years before. To him, music was never about popularity, it was about connection. Still, the silence that followed the applause began to feel heavier. He once said to a friend, "I don't mind if they forget my name, as long as they remember the feeling." That was who he was, the artist who valued emotion over fame. But the truth was harder. Fame fades faster than any melody, and the man who sang of standing by love now found himself standing mostly alone. The late 1960 period brought more challenges, declining sales, inconsistent management, and the frustration of knowing his artistry deserved more recognition. He wasn't angry, but there was a sadness in his eyes during interviews, a quiet acknowledgement that the world had moved on. By the decade's end, Ben E. King had gone from the top of the charts to the edges of the industry. Still, he never stopped singing. His voice remained steady, full of that same grace that had once moved the world. But in the silence between songs, something else had begun to take root, the quiet ache of being forgotten. When the applause faded and the spotlight moved elsewhere, Ben E. King didn't disappear, he simply stepped into a quieter chapter of his life. The hits had slowed down, the record deals weren't as promising, and the calls from the big studios came less often. But he never lost his sense of who he was. He had built a career on faith, not fame, and now that faith was being tested in ways he had never imagined. Through the 1970 period, the music industry had transformed completely. Funk and disco ruled the radio. Young stars took over television. The kind of soul that once defined America was now treated like nostalgia. For many artists of his generation, this shift felt like exile. They were pioneers turned footnotes, but King refused to see it that way. When the big labels stopped calling, he found another stage, the oldies circuit, a collection of theaters, clubs, and small festivals where the legends of yesterday could still find an audience that remembered every word. Some artists saw it as humiliation. To King, it was redemption. He still had a voice, and he intended to use it. He would walk onto those smaller stages in tailored suits, holding the microphone with the same calm assurance he had decades earlier. When he sang, "Stand by Me," the room would grow silent not because it was old, but because it was eternal. You could see couples in their 60s holding hands, remembering their youth, and younger listeners discovering the song for the first time. It wasn't about fame anymore, it was about connection. But behind that quiet triumph lay struggle. Touring was exhausting. The travel was long, the pay inconsistent. The industry's attention was elsewhere. Reporters rarely called. Yet, every night, King gave everything he had. Even as the years wore on, his voice never lost its warmth. He would smile and tell friends, "The audience stood by me, that's enough." Still, there were moments of doubt. Watching younger acts rise, watching the trends change, he sometimes wondered if he had been forgotten. Not as a man, but as an artist. His contributions had built bridges that others now crossed without ever knowing his name. Then, quietly, hope returned. Word spread that Atlantic Records was open to bringing back one of its legends. King returned to the label that had once shaped his success and released new material. His 1975 album Supernatural gave him a modest hit with "Do It in the Name of Love." It wasn't a chart topper, but it was proof he still belonged. That spark kept him going. Though the world no longer revolved around him, Ben King carried himself with the same grace that had defined his peak years. Fame had come and gone, but his purpose hadn't changed. He once said in an interview, "I never sang to be remembered. I sang because it made people feel something." And in the quiet years, that purpose became his sanctuary. By the late 1970 period, Ben King had settled into a life that was quiet but steady. He wasn't chasing fame anymore. He was a working musician, traveling from city to city, singing songs that once defined an era. There were no tour buses lined with gold, no red carpets, just him, his voice, and the audiences who still cared. It would have been easy to grow bitter. Many artists from his generation did. They looked at the new wave of stars, disco kings, pop idols, and MTV sensations and felt erased. But not Ben. When asked how he handled being out of the spotlight, he simply said, "I've had my time in the Sunday, now I sing for the love of it." And he meant it. Yet the business side of things was harsher. Without major label support, his records reached fewer people. Royalties came in slower, opportunities fewer. The man who had once inspired a generation of soul singers now had to fight for recognition in an industry he helped build. It was the cruel rhythm of entertainment, the same system that lifts you up will one day forget your name. But destiny, it seems, has a strange sense of timing. In 1986, a new film titled Stand By Me was released, based on a Stephen King story. The producers chose Ben King's song, the very one he had written 26 years earlier, as its theme. When the movie hit theaters, so did the song. And suddenly, the world remembered. Radio stations began replaying Stand By Me. Teenagers who weren't even born when it first topped the charts were now humming along. The song reached the Billboard charts again, bridging generations in a way few songs ever could. It was as if time itself had paused to give him the recognition he'd been denied for so long. For King, it was more than success, it was vindication. After decades of quiet work, the universe had brought his voice back to the forefront. He didn't celebrate loudly, that wasn't his nature. But friends recalled that he smiled more during those years, that there was peace in his eyes. He started performing again with renewed joy, often including the Drifters classics in his show. In interviews, when asked about the resurgence, he said softly, "That song's always been bigger than me. It belongs to everyone who's ever needed someone to stand by them. Still, even with the revival, Hollywood's recognition remains selective. While Stand By Me earned universal praise, his broader legacy as a solo pioneer who shaped modern soul was often overlooked. He wasn't inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo artist, only as a member of the Drifters. To many, that felt unjust. But if that bothered him, he never showed it. He carried himself with the same quiet grace that had defined his career from the start. Success had once made him famous. Now, humility made him eternal. When the cameras stopped rolling and the applause faded again, Ben E. King was still singing not for the charts, not for the headlines, but for the love of music itself. He had learned something only time can teach, that true legacy isn't about staying in the spotlight. It's about what your voice leaves behind in the silence. Long after the curtain fell on his last performance, the voice of Ben E. King continued to drift through time, calm, eternal, and full of grace. It wasn't the kind of legacy you measure in trophies or headlines. His legacy lived quietly in the hearts of people who still turned up the radio when Stand By Me began to play, even decades later. In an age obsessed with fame, King's story became a quiet reminder that greatness doesn't need to shout. His music spoke in tones of tenderness and truth, two qualities that never go out of style. When younger artists like Marvin Gaye, Al Green, and later Seal and John Legend shaped their sound, they borrowed from the emotional depth that King had brought to popular music. His phrasing, his control, his way of letting silence carry as much weight as sound all became hallmarks of the modern soul tradition. He wasn't a man of many words, but his songs said everything. Spanish Harlem carried romance like a whispered prayer. Don't Play That Song transformed heartbreak into art. And Stand By Me, that timeless hymn of faith and loyalty, became an anthem for generations searching for something to hold on to. The power of that song reached far beyond music. It was sung at weddings, protests, funerals, and family gatherings. It played in churches and movie theaters, across cities and continents. During the civil rights movement, it became a quiet promise of solidarity. In moments of loss, it became a comfort. Few songs in American history have meant so many different things to so many people, and all of it came from one man's honest voice. As the years passed, Ben E. King began to receive long overdue recognition. Critics revisited his catalog, describing him as the bridge between gospel and pop, a man who helped give R&B its dignity. In interviews, he remained humble. When asked how he wanted to be remembered, he said, "Just as a singer who tried to sing with heart." In 2009, he was inducted into the North Carolina Music Hall of Fame, honoring his roots. 3 years later, in 2012, he was welcomed into the Songwriters Hall of Fame, a recognition that celebrated not just his voice, but his craft. Still, there was one honor missing, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction as a solo artist. Fans and historians continue to campaign for it, arguing that few voices defined the era like his. But perhaps the truest recognition doesn't come from institutions. It comes from the people who still hum his melodies without even realizing it, from the couples who choose Stand By Me as the soundtrack to their love, and from the strangers who still feel less alone when they hear his words. Because Ben E. King's legacy isn't just musical, it's human. It's the sound of endurance, the art of simplicity, and the courage to sing with honesty even when the world stops listening. And that voice, soft, steady, unforgettable, still stands. When Ben E. King passed away on the 30th of April, 2015, the news traveled quietly, almost too quietly for a man who had once carried the sound of a generation. There were no grand headlines or television specials, just a steady wave of gratitude from musicians, fans, and people who had lived their lives with his songs as their companions. In the days that followed, tributes poured in from across the world. Some came from artists who had grown up idolizing him, others from those who had only discovered him later in life. They spoke of his humility, his grace, and the way his music could make even the hardest hearts soften. Stand By Me began to play again on radio stations, in memorial reels, in quiet cafes, and for a brief moment, the world paused to listen. America, by then, had changed beyond recognition from the one King had first sung to. The streets that once segregated audiences now celebrated his voice as part of a shared cultural memory. His music, born from gospel roots and Harlem's heartbeat, had become a permanent part of the nation's emotional vocabulary. You could hear it in the background of weddings, in television commercials, in movies that had nothing to do with him, proof that his art had become something larger than fame itself. In the United Kingdom, where nostalgia for early soul music never faded, his name had always carried reverence. British fans still filled theaters to hear his songs long after American audiences moved on. For them, Ben E. King wasn't a forgotten legend, he was an enduring poet of love and resilience. His passing also reignited a conversation among music historians. Why had it taken so long for the industry to honor him properly? How could a man whose song was one of the most performed and recorded in history still be waiting for solo recognition from the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? The question lingered, not out of outrage, but out of quiet sadness, the kind that comes when a nation realizes it took a voice for granted. But even without that final accolade, his influence remained undeniable. Modern artists cited him as a foundational figure, the man who proved that soul could be both sophisticated and spiritual. From gospel choirs in Alabama to jazz clubs in London, young singers still study his phrasing, his patience, and that unteachable restraint that made his voice timeless. His family described him not as a celebrity, but as a man of peace. He spent his later years performing charity concerts, mentoring young artists, and reminding everyone that success meant nothing if you couldn't share it. When fans met him after shows, he didn't rush them. He listened. He always listened. In the end, his rediscovery wasn't about a comeback, it was about remembrance. The world finally realized that his songs had never really gone away. They had simply been waiting for ears ready to hear them again. And when people pressed play, it wasn't just nostalgia they felt. It was gratitude for a man who gave the world music that could outlast pain, outlast time, and outlast even his own name. Because Benny King may have left the stage, but his echo still fills the silence, gentle, faithful, and standing tall. The lights dim again. A single microphone stands in the quiet, just as it did when our story began. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear it, that voice, smooth as silk and strong as prayer, echoing softly through the years. Ben E. King never needed a crown to be called a king. His greatness came from humility, from his ability to make people feel seen through a song. He wasn't chasing immortality, he was chasing truth. And somehow, that truth gave him the very thing he never asked for: eternity. Stand By Me was more than a song. It was a promise to stay faithful, to endure, to love without condition. Decades after it first filled the airwaves, it still holds the same power. Every generation that hears it finds a piece of themselves in its words. That's not just the mark of a hit record, that's the mark of a soul that never stopped believing. When he left this world in 2015, there were no grand farewells, just quiet remembrance. But maybe that was how it was meant to be, because Ben's story was never about noise. It was about resonance, about the way a single voice, sung with honesty, could outlast the industry that forgot it. He showed us that success fades, but sincerity endures. That fame is fragile, but integrity, that's forever. So tonight, or wherever you are right now, if you ever felt comforted by that song, if those words ever gave you strength then in your own way, you've already stood by him. Because legends don't live in the spotlight. They live in the hearts of those who still listen. Ben E. King may have left the stage, but his voice still stands clear, calm, and eternal. Do you think Hollywood ever gave him the respect he truly deserved? If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and help keep his voice alive. Share your favorite Ben E. King memory in the comments, because remembering is how legends live forever. And as the lights fade for the last time, one truth remains: some stars never fade. They just shine where fewer eyes can see.